Hello again, 122. To conclude how North Vietnam gains control of all of Vietnam, and to answer the question of the meaning of detente and how diplomatic relations were finally restored with the People's Republic of China. So what is the role of China in this second Indo-Chinese conflict going on now between the United States and the North Vietnamese, or the Viet Cong? Chinese leaders observed the gradual escalation of the conflict in South Vietnam with mixed feelings. They were undoubtedly pleased to have a firm communist ally, and one that had in many ways followed the path of Mao Zedong, but just beyond to their southern frontier. But they were concerned that this bloodshed was going to enmesh China in a new conflict with the United States. And they didn't welcome the specter of a powerful and ambitious united Vietnam, which might wish to extend its influence throughout mainland Southeast Asia, an area Beijing considered its own backyard. So Chinese leaders therefore tiptoed delicately through the minefield of the Indo-China conflict. As the war escalated in 1964 and 1965, Beijing publicly announced that the Chinese people fully supported their comrades seeking national liberation, but privately assured Washington that China would not directly enter the conflict unless United States forces threatened its southern border. This is the same thing that happened with UN forces pursuing the North Koreans in the Korean conflict. As they got closer and closer to the Yalu River, MacArthur assured President Truman that the Chinese were not going to get involved in the Korean conflict, and he was dead wrong. The Chinese jumped in, and that slowly turned the Korean conflict into a stalemate, and eventually there is negotiated truce in July of '53 in the Eisenhower administration, dividing the country between North and South, where it still is today at the 38th parallel. Beijing also refused to cooperate fully with Moscow. There's a split between these two. We'll more on that in a moment. In shipping Soviet goods to North Vietnam through Chinese territory. Despite its dismay at the lack of full support from China, the communist government in North Vietnam responded to the United States escalation by infiltrating more of its own regular troops into the South, and by 1968 the war had reached a stalemate. The communists were not strong enough to overthrow the government in Saigon, whose weakness was shielded by the presence of 500,000 United States troops. But President Johnson was reluctant to engage in all-out war on North Vietnam for fear of provoking a global nuclear conflict. In the fall, after the communist-led Tet Offensive undermined claims of progress in Washington, and that's the end of the Johnson administration, the war in Vietnam destroyed his presidency because it aroused intense anti-war protests in the United States, and actually peace negotiations were beginning at this time. So the quest for peace. Richard Nixon wins in the fall of '68, and he comes into the White House in 1969 on a pledge to bring honorable end to the Vietnam War. Peace with honor was his slogan. And with the United States public opinion sharply divided on the war in Vietnam, he began to withdraw United States troops while continuing to hold peace talks in Paris. But the centerpiece of his strategy was to improve relations with China, and thus undercut Chinese support for the North Vietnamese war effort. And during the 1960s, relations between Moscow and Beijing had reached a point of extreme tension, and thousands of troops were stationed on both sides of their long common frontier. And this was the propaganda poster that came after the 1950 Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation was negotiated, and the two leaders, however, really didn't get along. And when Stalin dies in 1953, Mao believed that he should assume the leadership role of the worldwide communist movement, but the Russian successors to Stalin, Malenkov and then Khrushchev and Brezhnev, did not agree with this, and eventually China and the Soviet Union do not get along. It will become common knowledge by the end of the 1960s. So, sensing an opportunity to split the two one-time rivals, Nixon sent his emissary, Dr. Henry Kissinger, on a secret trip with a ping pong team. Yes, parts of Forrest Gump do have some truth, ladies and gentlemen. Kissinger was aboard with that ping pong team and responding to assurances that the United States was determined to withdraw from Indochina, and it hoped to improve relations with the mainland regime. Chinese leaders invited President Nixon to visit China in early 1972. Now, in so doing, when Nixon went to China, the fervent anti-communist Nixon, that got Moscow's attention. And that's going to lead to détente between Moscow and the United States, because the Chinese and the Americans put aside their differences over Taiwan to pursue a better mutual relationship. Now, to conclude how North Vietnam gets control of all of Vietnam, the fall of Saigon, and incensed at the apparent betrayal by their close allies, the North Vietnamese leaders decided to seek a peaceful settlement of the war with the United States. And in January of 1973, a peace treaty was signed in Paris calling for the removal of all United States forces from South Vietnam. And in return, the Communists agreed to halt military operations and to engage in negotiations to resolve their differences with the Saigon regime. But those negotiations, North and South, over the political settlement soon broke down, and in early 1975, the Communists resumed the offensive, and in the end of April, under a massive assault by North Vietnamese military forces, the South Vietnamese government surrendered, and in 1976, the country was unified under communist rule. The communist victory in Vietnam was a severe humiliation for the United States, but its strategic impact was limited because of the new relationship with China. And this era of détente will last a short time in the 1970s. Because by the early 1970s, a new age in Soviet-American relations had emerged. The Soviets had their reasons for doing this. Their economy, we know now, is in shambles, and they've got to cut military spending. And this is a French term meaning a reduction or a thaw in the Cold War, a reduction of tensions between the two sides. And a symbol of that was the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, often called SALT I, for the strategic arms limitation talks that were signed between Moscow and the United States in 1972. They agreed in this treaty to limit the size of their anti-ballistic missile systems, and that will be undermined by President Reagan with Star Wars. Washington's objective in pursuing the treaty was to make it unlikely that either superpower could win a nuclear exchange by launching a preemptive strike. This is the policy of equivalence, whether in the air, under the sea with submarines, or with intercontinental ballistic missiles. Both sides had roughly equal power, and they believed that that was the best way to avoid a nuclear confrontation. And that's basically what happened during the Cold War, ladies and gentlemen, is that the arms race actually kept the peace because of equivalence. And in the early 70s, détente was pursued in other ways as well. This works for Nixon very, very well. He took office in 1969. He sought to increase trade and cultural contacts with the Soviet Union. His purpose was to set up a series of linkages in United States-Soviet relations that would persuade Moscow of economic and social benefits of maintaining good relations with the West. And a symbol of that new relationship was the Helsinki Accord, signed in 1975 by the United States, Canada, and all European nations on both sides of the Iron Curtain. It recognized all the borders that had been established since the end of World War II, and that acknowledged for the first time the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. The Helsinki Accords also committed the signatories to recognize and protect human rights of its citizens, a clear effort by Western states to improve the performance of the Soviet Union and its allies. This is the beginning of the end of the totalitarian state of the Soviet Union. There can't be human rights in a totalitarian regime, but they agreed to sign it in recognition for their sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, and that's going to end up undermining them. Détente will be ended by renewed tensions in the Third World. And it really undermined the presidency of President Carter because human rights were huge to Carter. And just at the point when U.S. involvement in Vietnam came to an end and relations with China began to improve, in 1975 and 76, U.S.-Soviet relations began to sour once again. After the link-up in space with Soyuz and Skylab and the Soviet cosmonaut and the American astronaut, that was the height of détente. That was on television. They shook hands in space. But now all of that is going away. Some Americans had become increasingly concerned about aggressive new tendencies in Soviet foreign policy. The first indication came in Africa. Soviet influence was on the rise in Somalia, across the Red Sea from South Yemen, and later in neighboring Ethiopia. In Angola, once a colony of Portugal, an insurgent movement was supported by Castro and Cuban troops. They helped to get this movement into power. And in 1979, this is the end completely of détente. Soviet troops were sent across the border into Afghanistan to protect a newly installed Marxist regime facing internal resistance from fundamentalist Muslims. Some observers suspected that the ultimate objective of Soviet advance into hitherto neutral Afghanistan was to extend Soviet power into the oil fields of the Persian Gulf. And to deter such a possibility, the White House promulgated the Carter Doctrine, which stated that the United States would use its military power if necessary to safeguard Western access to oil reserves in the Middle East. In fact, sources in Moscow later disclosed that the Soviet advance had little to do with oil of the Persian Gulf, but was an effort to increase Soviet influence in a region increasingly beset by Islamic fervor. Soviet officials feared that Islamic activism could spread to the Muslim populations in the Soviet republics in Central Asia, and they were confident that the United States was too distracted by so-called Vietnam syndrome, the public fear of U.S. involvement in another Vietnam-type conflict, to respond. Another reason for the growing suspicion of the Soviet Union and the United States was that some U.S. defense analysts, Paul Nietzsche, once again we talked about him, they began to think that the Soviets were rejecting equivalence and seeking actual strategic superiority in nuclear weapons, and accordingly, they argued for a substantial increase in U.S. defense spending, and Reagan will implement this in the 80s. Such charges, combined with all this activism in Africa and the Middle East, and also reports of the persecution of Jews and dissidents in the Soviet Union, this undermined support for détente in the United States, and these changing attitudes were reflected in the failure of the Carter administration to obtain congressional approval of SALT II, signed with the Soviet Union in 1979. As the 80s dawned, the Cold War was heating up again. And this is a good chronology of the Cold War, and again, it ends with this invasion. It heats up once again. And during these times, in the mid-70s, détente was flowering. And it was a big, definite accomplishment of the Nixon administration, but it fell apart during Carter's presidency. And this is the post-Cold War document. This is well worth a read in the 7th edition at the end of chapter 26. This is cut off at the top. Global Village, or a clash of civilizations. Francis Fukuyama and Samuel Huntington have very different views on the post-Cold War world. And so ends chapter 26.